Greetings, neighbors. This is Reflections, the show sponsored by the Paducah Cooperative Ministry, where we, all of us together, do God's work with human hands. My name's Gregory Waldrop, and I'm your co-host for the Reflection show, and we have a guest co-host with us this week. We have Zack Browning from the Reedland Christian Church. Welcome, Zack.
Good to be here.
Glad you're here. Tell us a little bit about the church and what's going on there with you.
Got a lot going on. We're heading into VBS season with the summer, doing some church camps, and there's a lot of good stuff going on. I'm glad to be here and glad to fill in for Karen while she's gone. I hope she has a good trip and gets back safe.
That's a good gift. Thank you for being here. This is our week to have Bible study, and we're very fortunate to have two members of our community with us. We have Corey Aker, who is the new pastor at St. Paul Lutheran Church. Welcome, Corey.
Thank you very much.
Glad you're here. Yeah, tell us a little bit about your location and where you're from and how you've gotten here.
Well, as you say, I'm a new pastor at St. Paul. I'm originally from South Dakota, and we're loving Paducah. It feels like home for us, so that's great. Over at the church, like Zack, we have a Vacation Bible School coming up, and one thing that I especially enjoy doing is a class called Christ Central, and we're kind of going through that. It's a teaching of the faith class, and we're in our third session of that, and it's really going well. Those are on Wednesday nights. And
great.
Yeah.
Is that for anybody, or is it
anybody
age
can come?
or?
Yep.
Yeah,
Christian, non-Christian, any ages. Yep.
Super.
So,
well, we're glad you're here. We're glad you're in Paducah with us. I'm glad
Thank
you're
you,
with us
too.
today. Yeah, great. We also have with us Christopher Rollins from the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Paducah.
Yes,
welcome, Christopher. Glad you're here.
Thank you very much.
And tell us a little bit about what's going on at the Adventist Church.
Okay, obviously this is VBS season, so we can't escape that one. Lots of stuff going on. Probably the biggest thing that we have going on that the community recognizes is the program that we do called Bags of Love, where we give gift bags, or not so much gift bags, but care packages to children that have been removed from their homes by the Department of Child Services for drug-related issues and stuff like that. Keeps us busy. We've got a handful of other things going on. It's a lot of fun.
Great.
So.
Well, welcome, and
Thank
welcome
you.
to the Bible study, all of you. Glad we're all here. We're glad the folks are with us here. Zack, will you read us the scripture for today?
Sure. We're going to be in Luke chapter 12. We're going to start at verse 13, and I'm going to read down to verse 21. I'll be reading from the New Living Translation, so it's a little different from what you're reading. Just follow along with my voice. Starting at Luke 12:13, it says, "Then someone called from the crowd, 'Teacher, please tell my brother to divide our father's estate with me.' And Jesus replied, 'Friend, who made me a judge over you to decide such a thing as that?' And then he said, 'Beware, guard against every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how much you own.' And then he told them a story. He said, 'A rich man had a fertile farm that produced fine crops. And he said to himself, "What should I do? I don't have room for all my crops." And then he said, "I know. I'll tear down my barns. I'll build bigger ones. Then I'll have room to store all of what my wheat and other goods I have. And I'll sit back and I'll say to myself, my friend, you have stored up enough for years to come. Now take it easy. Eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, you will die this very night. Then who will get everything you worked for? Yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God himself."
Amazing words, huh?
Indeed.
Striking words. What are your thoughts on those words?
well, one of the first things that I look at, I know we're studying the parable itself, but as we look at the last section right before the parable, Jesus says, "A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." So, and then we jump into this parable that Jesus has to explain what he means, or give a little example of what he means. So for us, that means, you know what? We are not the sum total of all the stuff we accumulate before we die. Now, to our society, I think that kind of goes against the grain a little bit, as Jesus regularly does. But I think that is the most important point leading up to the parable itself, is that we're not these things that we have. It's a misunderstanding if we think that we are.
Isn't that interesting, too, that, I mean, I thought that we were the only culture to have been obsessed by our possessions. But it looks like 2,000 years ago, the temptations were the same.
Yep.
That to somehow measure your life by what you had, what you'd accumulated, what you'd put together, stored up, huh?
Yeah.
It's also interesting when you consider that the word that's used in my version is covetousness. We use greed or a handful of other words that go here. But this man is a covetous man, and in verse 16 it says specifically, he was a certain rich man. He was already rich.
Yeah.
He already had enough to sustain him for years to come. He could already say, sit back, eat, drink, and be merry, but it wasn't enough. And it's also very interesting, we're talking about going against the grain of what our society teaches. When is it ever enough?
Yeah.
Do you ever have enough in the bank account? Is your retirement ever big enough?
Or can you ever retire early enough? That's kind of the thing today.
Yeah,
that's true.
The judge. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sure, I find it interesting how people kind of measure themselves. That philosophy of keeping up with the Joneses, your neighbors. Do I have a big enough boat? The neighbors have got a new car. My buddy's got a new motorcycle, and I've got to have that, the bigger and the better, and it never quits. It's not just I'm satisfied with what the Lord's blessed me with.
Mm-hmm.
God blesses us with enough. With just what we need, and it's our desire to go beyond that, to have a bigger and better car, a bigger and better house, a bigger and better family. People leave certain aspects of their life behind because they want bigger and better things.
Right.
And we become obsessed with that. And Jesus, in a lot of ways that he does, he turns these people on their ear and he says, life's not about what you have physically, possession-wise. It's about so much more.
Yeah. That word enough is an interesting word, isn't it? That I know in the Jewish litany for Passover, there's this wonderful litany about dainu, they call it. Dainu. It would have been enough. It would have been enough, but God blessed us more. It would have been enough.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, out of the deepest, most ancient part of our traditions, these temptations have been with the human creature, hasn't it?
Well, we can go all the way back to the Garden of Eden, can't we? God gave to Adam and Eve every tree in the garden, but one. But it wasn't enough. They had to have every tree. Every tree. I mean, so we can go back even before litany, we can go even before religion. We can go back to the Garden of Eden when it was just two people. And this has been something that we have struggled with from the very, very beginning.
It is interesting. And he picked this up in a lot of ways. In one of the other parables, and Jesus talked about the thorns choking out life. You remember in the parable of the sower?
Yes.
And he specifically identifies the thorns with the cares
of this world.
The possessions and that sort of thing. I mean, it's interesting. It's easy to see and discover this as a sort of a primary temptation of us humans from the very earliest, earliest on.
Kind of moving through the parable seems to be set in contrast with another way of thinking about things. So here we've got the rich fool, a greedy guy who wants, like we've been saying, everything. Well, in the next part is a real familiar passage about the don't worry about anything passage, because God's going to take care of everything. Yep. In fact, Jesus says, right after telling this parable, he says, therefore I tell you, don't worry about your life, what you're going to eat, or about what you're going to wear. So you see the sharp contrast that he's putting between our worries and trying to get everything for ourselves, as if we do, as if these aren't gifts from God. Mm-hmm. And that's what that rich fool is all about. He's the guy who wants it all and thinks that he's getting it all for himself. Yeah. God's not in the picture for him.
We're studying at church Genesis, and we're to the 11th chapter, which is, of course, the Tower of Babel, and it's that great line in there where they decided they were going to make a name for themselves, rather than welcome the name God had given them, rather than take for themselves the name that God had bestowed. And I mean, it's the same story, isn't it? It's somehow not trusting that what God gives is enough, whatever it is.
I think to me that's the problem that this man has. Jesus begins to tell a story. He loves to, these parables that we go through. He's such a storyteller, and he tells a story. And a lot of people in Jewish context, they would think that this man was blessed because when people had bumper crops, when people had a lot of possessions, that meant they were godly. That meant that God was blessing their right actions. But we see, even if he had been, that wealth kind of went to his brain, and that's where the problem comes into the story at. It's not bad that he has this bumper crop. In fact, he doesn't have enough places to store it. And probably a godly person might have thought, I probably need to give my extra to the poor. I probably need to give my extra to, for the kingdom of God in some way, but not him. He said, I'm tearing my barns and my silos down. I'm going to build a ton of places. And then he gets to that point where he says, I'm going to take it easy. I've got it made. It's all about me. He doesn't consider anybody else. And that part of the story is where Jesus really, I think, starts to hit in on people, the temptations.
Right.
True. I remember being a kid, my grandfather, where I grew up, he knew just about everybody. He worked for the co-op, and so he sold fertilizer to all the farmers in that region. And so we could drive by houses, and he knew everybody. It's like, yeah, I know them, yeah, I know them, and I know them. And as time got on, he got older, and I got older, and we'd be driving along here or there, and he'd have all these stories about these people who, for whatever reason, he was talking about, leading into this, he keeps talking about the inheritance and the covetousness that there is in people. And we would drive by, and he says, when that person over there died, story has it that the kids were outside in the yard in a fist fight, fighting over the things that their dad had because they wanted it all for their very selves. I mean, and to me as a little kid, I'm driving by here and I'm saying, I'm trying to imagine these grown adults, some of them 50, some of them maybe even 60 years old, in a fist fight in the yard, fighting over their dead parents' possessions. Because what they had apparently was enough. It was enough up until that point, but the second there was the opportunity for more, never mind. What I have is not enough. I've got to have more.
And it looks as if these people that came to Jesus are, maybe moments away from your grandpa's story, they're trying to divvy up this inheritance.
Right.
And that's, Jesus doesn't talk about the inheritance then. He goes into a parable about greed, which is, what brings people to blows in these situations.
Yeah.
Greed for more. I want it all.
I think of the story about Paul, where he is praying to God that this so-called thorn in the flesh, whatever it may have been, he was asking that God would remove it. And I just love the response that God gives. My grace is sufficient. Or in this situation, my grace is enough. It is sufficient for you. I guess it kind of goes back to that trust issue. And if we go back to the Garden of Eden, that's really what the covetousness of Eve was about. It was about, who will I trust more? Will I trust God, or will I trust the serpent?
Right.
And it goes right down to the heart. Paul could look at it and say, well, maybe it's not enough. And if it's not enough, then what do you do? And I look at our situation in the world in which we live. It's hard. It really is. If you want to keep up with the Joneses, it is really difficult to say it's enough. Right. God's grace is enough. Whatever He gives is enough. But what fascinates me in all the places I've been, and I haven't been too many places, but I've been a few places where people are much poorer than we are. And what fascinates me about these people is that these people are happy.
Yeah, satisfied.
They are satisfied with what they have. And one of my churches, I pastor 2 churches, and in my smaller church I have, well, in both of my churches I have a variety of different ranges as far as economically speaking. And to talk to the richer people, it's never enough. And to talk to the poorer people, it seems like they're the only happy people in the whole church. It's like God has blessed us so much. I mean, there's so many people in the world much worse off than we are. We have a warm place to live. We have food to eat. We've got enough.
Right, it's enough.
Yeah.
It's enough. And it's like, wow. I wonder what it takes to have such an attitude in the world in which we live.
Yeah, you have to be satisfied in the blessings that you receive. Me and my wife are planning on going to Mexico for our 1-year anniversary, and we've been talking to different people that have been to the resorts and places down there. One of the deacons from my church brought up a story. He said that when they went down there, they went to one of the all-inclusive resorts to where you just pay a flat fee, and everything is at your disposal. You can have as much to drink, you can have as much to eat, you can go anywhere. And he said a lot of the Americans were asking, well, do we have to tip? Do we have to give any more? Is there it was almost they were being greedy. And he was talking to a gentleman that was working as a waiter, and he said, I just got a raise. And he said, really? So that's kind of interesting. And the guy said, I am making $15 a day. And to us, we would think that is just subpar. It's, absolutely, we couldn't take that. Most of us would want to make $15 an hour, but that was feeding a family of 8. And he was so happy, he was so excited, and that was something that was a blessing for him. And they began to talk, and they lived in a small one-room house, dirt floor, but he was happy. He was satisfied with his family, with his children, and he lived in a beautiful Caribbean environment. And our 1 week that we're supposed to be out and about, we are this man. We're eating, we're drinking, we're being merry, and we can't be satisfied enough. Where other people are just happy with the blessings they get from God. And we have to absorb that attitude that, just like you're talking about, what God has given us is enough. His grace is sufficient. His blessings are sufficient.
Still, it's contrary.
Yes. It is.
It's contrary.
It's against the grain, isn't it? I'm interested in that part of the passage that says God's response. This night, my translation is that your soul is required of you. I think yours went on and said you're going to die. I had a teacher who had an interesting perspective on this. He said that, he'd been around a whole lot of people whose soul had been required of them years before, but had the terrible fortune to then have to live their life soullessly in pursuit of this greed, this kind of accumulation, soullessly moving to the kind of to the barren economic measurements that, and I was been very intrigued by that. That, in fact, what maybe his worst punishment here was having to live life in pursuit of this which he, in fact, pursued, gone after.
Well, just as we're discovering here, greed is it's a vice that is never full. It's never enough. Every time you turn around, you always have to have more. You can fight and you can work and you can do all this other stuff, and it's never enough. You've never come to a place where you can sit back and just take pleasure in what God has given to you. It's a rough place to live your life, and unfortunately I have a feeling that all of us know somebody, or at least a handful of people maybe, who they live their lives without any thought, just as this man did here, without any thought to the people around him or her, and all they want is more, more, and the more they get, the more greedy they are, the more they the more they want, and the less they think about everybody else. I've learned one thing, and that is that the more you have to worry about.
True. I think one word that kind of sums up everything that everybody's saying about this greed idea is slavery. This guy is in slavery to his possessions. So, and that's what Jesus is saying. We're not made up of these possessions. That's not our life. But when you make it your life, well, now they have complete control over you. Yes. And, Paul talks about not allowing anything to have control over him. Well, this guy's given into it big time. For example, when he's talking about, all right, what am I going to do with all this extra wealth? Hey, look at me. Look at all I've done. I'm going to have to build some more barns here. I'm doing real well. I'm going to prove it with, everybody that walks by will be able to see how well I'm doing here. Who's he consulting in all of this? Himself. I mean, there's nobody else going along here. So not only is he controlled by his greed, and his greed has become his God, but he himself has also become his God.
Yes.
So one way to kind of see this idea of his surplus being his God, too, I thought this was kind of interesting is for his God, now he has built this fabulous temple in which he can place his God, his surplus of
monument.
Yeah,
He's
right.
built his own monument.
That's right. And, hey, come worship with me. Come worship my surplus with me. Yeah,
that's for sure. And I like what you said about that living without a soul. You know, when you take the soul away, that, you know, that spirit that we have inside of us that longs to serve God and that connects with the Lord, if you take that equation out, you know, of life, the flesh is all that's left. Right. And the flesh is never satisfied. We can't get enough to eat. We can't get enough to drink. We can't get enough fun. We can't get enough, you know, pleasure and good feeling. And that's something that when we take God out of our lives, that's all we have left. We can never truly be satisfied. You know? And that's something that if we put that spirit in and that spirit dominates us, you know, it literally, we become a brand new person. Like Paul talks about, the old is gone and the new has come. We have a different mindset. We don't want the things that we used to want. We don't do the things that we used to do. We become different people, you know, God servers as opposed to self-servers.
It's interesting, going back to the Garden of Eden, what happened when that spirit that they originally had was taken out and what they became. They became self-preservationists. Everybody but the serpent had somebody to blame. It's somebody else's fault. The only ones that they were concerned about. The second that became part of their character, they stopped thinking about anybody but themselves.
I can remember in an early church that I served, a lady who didn't have large barns. In fact, she had quite a modest home. However, somewhere in her life, it became clear to me that she'd said, well, whatever else I'm going to do, when I retire, when I get old, I'm going to have money. And in honor of that, she had alienated every person in her life.
Wow.
Her brother, her family, her kin, her friends. There was nobody around her. She did have a bag of money that kept her company, but she came to realize very quickly how soulless that kind of existence was.
It wasn't enough.
And how and repented of that in all kinds of important ways. But I think that happens to us in all sorts of ways. It doesn't have to be just big barns, does it, or big houses or big cars. Sometimes there are all sorts of little ways we say, whatever else, I'm going to trust in money or in my possessions to keep me away from death, or keep me, you know, comfortable in my retirement. And that's a pretty soulless way. By itself.
One of the things that I was thinking about, looking at that, now your soul is going to be removed from you. All this time, he had been misunderstanding these gifts that God had given him, misunderstanding where they came from, what the purpose of them are. Now, uninvited, comes God, and he says, all right, you've been misunderstanding this whole time. Fool! Calls him a fool, and then he takes his life from him. Now, I think right at that moment, this guy understands, oh my goodness, I was being a fool. I was misunderstanding this whole time. Then at the last moment of his life, finally understanding comes in, and just, I mean, I don't think that we could quite imagine the remorse and regret that would come from that, looking back over the course of his life and all this that he'd done. And there it is. That's the end. What was it all for?
Nothing. And I like that you make that point. What he's serving is physical. It's temporary. You know, the moth will come in and eat. You know, the rust will come in and damage all the gold that he has. But when we serve God, there's an everlasting reward for us. You know, there's somebody that said the other day, we were at a funeral and they were talking, and he said, how much did he, you know, leave to the family? And somebody said, all of it. You know, he didn't take any of it with him, and you know that's the thing, is you can't take anything with you. You leave it all. And when you serve things that are temporary, your pleasure is temporary. But when you serve things that are eternal, like God and the Spirit, your reward is eternal, far beyond what we know today. And that's the key. That's where people's understanding has to change.
Sure. One question I wonder. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I wonder if we could discuss. It sounds like we're kind of coming down hard on people who have been given a lot. I mean, is it okay for us to have a lot of blessings? Or is it better to be poor? How do we kind of deal with that question? Should we be ashamed if we have a lot? Is it better to be poor? I wonder if we could discuss that for a minute.
Mm-hmm. I think it's an important question.
Yeah. I personally think that, as we said before, God blesses people, and I believe what we do with those blessings determines, where we're at in relation with God. I think there are a lot of people that have been given tons of money, tons of power and prestige, and they do good things with it, and that's why God continues to bless them. You've got these mega churches that are reaching out to the poor and doing things, and they continue to grow and grow and grow. And then you also have people that hoard that away. And that's, I think, the issue. Is not that it's bad to have money, it's bad to not use what you've been blessed with by God.
It's the attitude. You notice the passage doesn't come down on the wealth and the possessions. Right. It comes down on the attitude that the man had. I mean, even if we go a little bit later in the book of Luke, he says, to him who has shall be given, and to him who has not, even what he has shall be taken away from him. It's basically stating that if you're faithful with the things God gives you, he will give you more. But if you're not faithful with the things that you have, even what little bit you do have, God will have to take it away from you. And I don't think that it's so much a curse maybe, or a punishment of God, maybe as much as it is that God wants, he's willing to do what it takes to save us from sin. And if that means that he has to take some things away from us, sometimes maybe even our lives, he's willing to do that.
Yeah, I do think that my own sense, it's almost a physical thing. If you're clutching, grabbing onto wealth or anything for that matter, it's hard to let it loose and welcome in fact, this God who wants to be life and vitality and spirit for all of us. I do think there's I think the biblical record's pretty clear. We're most tempted, those with a lot are most tempted to hold them tight rather than welcoming God in whatever ways that happens.
I wanted to ask a question of the group as well. In verse 21 it says, so he who lays up treasure for himself is not rich toward God. And we know in other passages it says that we're not supposed to lay up treasure here on earth, but we're supposed to be laying up treasure in heaven. Okay, we've discussed the treasures here on earth. The most important thing is the treasures in heaven, because those are the things, that's where our heart is going to be. So how do we lay up our treasure in heaven as opposed to here on the earth? We know how to lay up treasure on the earth. We've been taught that from the time we were little kids. But maybe not so much laying up the treasure in heaven.
I hate to cut us off before we can answer that question, but we've run out of time. It goes fast, doesn't it?
Can't believe
We'll
it.
have to let that question linger with our audience and with each of us. And in some ways, the Bible does that all the time, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Puts those questions right in our laps to answer them with our lives.
Right. Question for all the people to take to their pastors this weekend.
That's right.
How do I get a spiritual 401k? How do I make that happen?
Well done. I'm so glad that you all have been with us. We're glad for Corey Akers, St. Paul Lutheran, Christopher Rollins at the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Thank you, brother co-host Zack Browning. Thank you all for being here. We're glad you've been here, and join us wherever you are, however you can, with Paducah Cooperative Ministry, doing God's work with human hands. Shalom.